because they're rare commodities. So do remember the book is available, and it is available now. And I think Jean wanted to invite all you here today to be part of a special event because, as she mentioned in one of her emails, the book was launched COVID style, which meant that it had very little immediate impact. So your presence today, I think, is a wonderful opportunity for us not simply to launch the book, but also to have a discussion about its remarkable content. My name is Alexander Rieford. I'm a historian by training. I manage a historic property in eastern Quebec called Les Jardins Métis. And I've talked a great deal to Jean about reputation and the politics of reputation, which is the unofficial title of today's talk. Because in my work managing a National Historic Site, we spend a lot of time managing reputations and creating them. And I think one of the remarkable aspects of Louis Saint Laurent is how he did not curate his reputation perhaps as masterfully as other Canadian politicians have done before and since. So I think we want to ask that question of some of the authors today. And we are joined by a remarkable coterie of authors, not least of whom, of course, is Jean. But for this special project, we've got a number of them on screen today, led by Stephen Azzi, who is the director of the Clayton H. Riddell Graduate Program in Political Management at Carleton University in Ottawa. Professor Azzi wrote a chapter in The Unexpected Louis Saint Laurent on Louis Saint Laurent's management style. And he's also the co-author of the Occasional Ratings of Canadian Prime Ministers, in which in the 2016 edition, Louis Saint Laurent is closely ahead of Jean Chrétien and slightly behind Lester Pearson. So he carefully analyzes the reputations of Canadian prime ministers and their ratings. Patrice Dutel, who is, of course, the editor of this book. Patrice is a professor of politics and public administration at Ryerson University in Toronto. He's the editor of The Unexpected Louis Saint Laurent, recently published by UBC Press, and the author of 4 chapters in the book. He's got many other books to his credit, including a similar collection of essays on Sir John A. Macdonald, who has had some reputational issues, as we all know, in the last number of months. Joining us also is Philippe Girard, who is professor of law at Osgoode Hall Law School, in Toronto, and the author of many prize-winning books. He wrote a chapter in the book on different aspects of the Louis Saint Laurent government's justice policy. Jean Riley, I don't think needs any introduction to those present, but I will do her the same treatment as others. She is not just the author of a chapter in this book, but of course the instigator of this remarkable project. And we look forward to hearing more about her project and her remembrances of her grandfather, Louis Saint Laurent. And joining us from Quebec is Bernard Saint Laurent, better known to many of us as Bernie, who was a journalist at CBC and Radio-Canada, and a great nephew of Louis Saint Laurent. And for those of us living here, is the voice of every election, I think, since, for many generations. So welcome to you all. This is not an academic forum. It's not a graduate session. It's a discussion, and we want to get the authors going and animating this discussion. So my job is to ask a few questions and get out of the way so that they can talk to you about the book and then invite you to take questions. So there is a chance for you to pose your questions via the chat components on this site. So by all means do so, and we will get to as many questions as we can as the evening progresses. We're anticipating an hour plus, so stay with us. And thank you for being here. Let me ask you, Jean, to begin with. This project started with you, your vision, your campaign to create or curate the reputation of Louis Saint Laurent. What energized you? What do you remember boast about your grandfather?
She has to unmute herself. Jean, unmute yourself.
Bottom left, try that.
Jean, click on the screen, bottom left.
Can the host unmute her?
I'm going to try. It'll work.
Unmute all to start with, and then we can mute back.
Yep.
I'm unmuted. Can you
There
hear
we
me?
go.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm so sorry about
Okay,
that.
now.
So the story explain this preoccupation of mine, which all of you, my friends, have had to put up with for the last 20 years. At the end of the 1998-99, I was invited to lunch with Jeffrey Pearson, Mr. Pearson's son, the former ambassador to Russia. And he said to me that he had spent 40% of his time for the last 25 years curating his father's reputation. Well, I was shocked. By then, I already had observed that Louis Saint Laurent was not very well known, and that what he had done and what his government had accomplished was being forgotten. But I had no idea that our family might have played a part in that neglect. I had not seen us as neglectful. So I spoke to Jean Pelletier, who was Mr. Chrétien's chief of staff, and Jean explained to me, he at that time was a witness to the fact that the Mulrooney papers were being curated with a great deal of care and considerable resources, and that Mr. Chrétien was preparing to do the same thing. Well, from that went a hope to write a book myself. I was very much encouraged by quite a prominent literary agent, and I tried. But the fact is, my grandfather, everything that he did was first rate, and I just didn't have the wherewithal to do it. And I had the good luck to remember that I had met Patrice Dutil and heard him speak and been very impressed by his passion for John A. MacDonald and the research he'd done. I invited him for lunch, and the rest you know. He said to me before the end of the lunch, "You're right. Your grandfather should be better known. You're going to do one chapter. You're going to go back to your nice, rich, full life, and we're going to assemble that." And it was about 4 years ago. And Patrice, thank you. And I want to say that fortune smiled on me and smiled on all of us, because I think history is important. And I think it gives me great satisfaction to imagine that Louis Saint Laurent might be better known. For me, he was my grandfather. He was a very engaged grandfather who made me feel that he cared about me, about what I thought. We conversed. He had a kind of radiance about his interest in me. So as you can imagine, I thrived. And with a little bit of distance from that, I think probably some of that was that he was a shy person. I think many shy people gravitate to children. It was well known that he didn't have much small talk, and he was charming, but in a very reserved way. He wasn't at ease at parties, and very often gravitated to children. Well, I was certainly the benefit of that. Part of what's interesting about that is that his shyness can be traced to the fact that his father ran the general store in Compton, Quebec. And Moïse Saint Laurent was outgoing, charming. He was good looking, he was charismatic. And Louis saw himself as the shy, clumsy son. And that positioning is part of what I think the word modesty doesn't fully describe it. He was very unassuming. It was part of why people were impressed by him, because he had a lot of qualities and a ferocious intellect, but he was very unassuming. Anyway, part of all that is, of course, my grandmother had Jeanne Renaud, who he fell in love with when he met her in Quebec City when he was at Laval. She was a huge personality. She was a diva. She was beautiful. She was spoiled. She liked everything that he never thought about. She liked beautiful things. She liked wine. She liked chocolate. She liked fine linens. She cared about everything that he never thought about. She had a tremendous amount of buoyancy. She was independent and quite capable. And I think I could describe her as a kind of domestic tyrant. And he loved that. He adored her. Fact is, by the time he got to Ottawa, they were old enough that, and she had sacrificed a lot to his working habits. And so she didn't like Ottawa much. And she stayed in her comfortable house in Quebec City where the cook and everybody looked, the chauffeur drove her around. And he was in Ottawa on his own. And it is part of what is now well known. He had bouts of depression. And depression or sadness or not, periods of darkness. The beneficiary of that in the family, this was not talked about, or certainly not at my level. What was said was that he didn't like being alone. So when he couldn't go to Quebec City for the weekend, I would be sent on the train to spend the weekend with him. And what a treat that was. In the end, the bouts of depression will be spoken about by some of you who will, I'm sure, speak to some of his political life and his performance. For me, it was most obvious after the election of 1957 because he blamed himself and he was quite verbal, and it was quite clear that he was deeply depressed by that. He recovered. He lived for many years. He recovered his sense of joy and interest in his grandchildren. The only other thing that I would mention before I cede the microphone is that one of the pleasures of the research that I did in my chapter was to research his life before he went into politics. His life in Quebec City, where he achieved a tremendous amount. He was an eminently successful lawyer, a corporate lawyer. He taught at Laval University. He was eventually invited to join the board of the Bank of Montreal, which was a kind of a summum of, in terms of status and prestige and success in Canada. And I think when he went into public life, he regarded it as public service. 2 of his children was during the war, 2 of his children were overseas, and he felt it was his turn. And I don't think that changed. And that has always inspired me. Alex, back to you.
Unmute. Alex, we can't hear you. Unmute. Alex, unmute.
Yes, thanks. This is going to be our main throughout. Jean, I don't want to let you off the hook quite so easily. Her essay is entitled Grand-Papa, A Portrait of the Man and His Family. Tell us how hard it is to write about your grandfather politician. How was that experience and exercise for you?
Well, to write about him as a politician, I knew was what I must not do, because I'm not a historian. That's exactly why Patrice proposed that I should focus on the personal. What was more difficult, but was selecting anecdotes and weaving together something that was going to be coherent to somebody else. And it was hard. I found it hard to resist making comments on the political front because, of course, as his grandchild, I had paid attention and had opinions on everything. So it wasn't hard. It was a great joy, and it's something that I recommend to everyone, to go back in your past and tear off those layers of wallpaper and bring back anecdotes and images. It's a very rich, wonderful experience. We don't want to live in the past, but my goodness, it's a beautiful place to visit.
Thank you, Jean. Patrice, so you're the the intellectual, the academic, the historian who pulled this together, 22 essays in a 522-page volume. The title is unusual. You call it, and indeed, those of you who have not seen the book, it really is beautiful with these really wonderful images that Jean has no doubt culled from a precious family archive of a rather starter-looking Saint-Laurent. The title, The Unexpected Louis Saint-Laurent, where does that come from and what are you trying to communicate?
Well, the whole project, what attracted me from the beginning was that I thought that Louis Saint-Laurent's reputation was not at the level it should be. So, I mean, working off on a hunch, I selected people, I invited colleagues and friends, people I knew who had worked on the 1950s, who might have something to say. And I brought them together, and as I expected, they all unearthed different aspects of the life of Louis Saint-Laurent, of his experience as a politician, as a prime minister, as a minister of justice. I called it unexpected because I think that what he revealed was something that was very different from what people expected at the time and still today. At the time, Mackenzie King, the prime minister, asked Louis Saint-Laurent to join his cabinet at the end of November. The minister of justice, Ernest Lapointe, had just died. Mackenzie King needed new representation out of Quebec, and Louis Saint-Laurent seemed to be the right kind of guy, a quiet, respectable, eminently respectable lawyer, corporate lawyer, guy who knew stuff, guy who knew people, but somebody who wouldn't cause a whole lot of trouble and who would toe the line. And so Louis Saint-Laurent, who's almost 60 years old at the time, which, you know, in 1941 is really old, says, okay, I'm going to make the sacrifice. I'll put aside my business. I'll join cabinet. If I can help, I'll help. And he did a good job, including some hard jobs, such as putting Japanese Canadians in internment camps. Things like that. When he became Minister of External Affairs, the first non-prime ministerial Minister of External Affairs, Secretary of State for External Affairs, Louis Saint-Laurent started to reveal himself. He discovered that he was quite comfortable dealing with the world. He met world leaders at the UN conference in 1945. He enjoyed that. He enjoyed that. He was a world traveler. He's a man who had traveled in the past. He knew Europe very well. And now he was talking to all sorts of world leaders and ministers of external relations. And he revealed himself as somebody who really enjoyed it and was good at it. He was good at a time when you needed a steady hand. Let's not forget that this is the beginning of the Cold War. Russia, whom we thought was a friendly nation, turns out to be an enemy, perhaps. Louis Saint-Laurent reveals himself. He reveals himself as a man, even more, as he becomes prime minister in November of 1948. He reveals himself as a policy entrepreneur, as a man who's not afraid to make decisions, as a man in command, quite comfortable in his skin, quite comfortable in campaigning. This is a guy who could give a great speech, undeniably, but nobody expected him to be a barn burner. And again, he's revealed in 1948 as quite an effective leader in cabinet. The first campaign in 1949 reveals him to be a formidable campaigner. I mean, he kisses every baby around. It's quite something. And he's engaged. In his first 100 days, he recognizes Israel. He signs up for NATO. I mean, there's all sorts of hesitation. Mackenzie King hated that kind of stuff, could not make decisions. Louis Saint-Laurent comes in, makes the decision. He visits Truman in Washington. All sorts of things that will continue to reveal the sense of idealism that Louis Saint-Laurent had, this vision that he had for the country. And all through his government, you see a pattern of entrepreneurship, of saying, yes, let's try this, let's do this, let's fight the Cold War. Yes, let's fight it. Let's be friendly to the poor. Let's help the economy. Let's invest in infrastructure. A whole range of things that we take for granted today. Equalization is one of his gifts. It becomes part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The RRSP, if you've invested in RSP and taken advantage of the RSP, you have Louis Saint Laurent to thank for that. So my point about the unexpected Louis Saint Laurent is that this is a man that we expected to be, as Jean says in her chapter so wonderfully, a man who did not like to pose. His photos are always rather staid, and yet she knew him as somebody who was warm, and I think that warm and engaged and engaging, and I think that the essays in this book, without any hand from me, reveal him to be equally as warm and entrepreneurial on the public policy side.
One of the issues you tackle in your book is the Uncle Louis notion on his first campaign, where his white mustache and his elegant tailoring makes him thought to be everyone's uncle and the sort of favorite elderly politician, and yet you make a pitch for him as being a very modern politician. You've indicated that, but maybe say a little bit more about Louis Saint Laurent as a modern figure in post Second War politics in Canada.
Absolutely, absolutely, he is. I mean, that's why I called it. I called the subtitle "The Politics and Policies for a Modern Canada." Everything, I mean, almost everything we consider today to be Canadian, to be a trademark Canadian thing, comes from him. The investment in the Canada Council, the Canadianization of the Governor General. Philip will talk about the move to end the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London as the final court of appeal. Louis Saint Laurent is the one who will decide that it is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is where the buck stops. There's a whole range of medals and honors that he creates, that his government creates. That's what makes him particularly of signal importance in Canadianizing symbols. And I think it's a very important aspect. There are great chapters. Christopher McCreary wrote a wonderful chapter in the book on how Saint Laurent systematically went over all sorts of honors, raised the profile of Canada, called things Canadian instead of British or British American or British North American. It was all about Canada. He really prepares the way for eventually the Canadian flag. That was a bridge too far. And then, of course, there's this whole thing about Canadian foreign policy, but we have lots of chapters on that. But that's really what I was after there. I mean, a really modern Canada, a Canada that for the first time invests in the developing world, in creating overseas assistance for the developing world. That's Louis Saint Laurent. That's all Louis Saint Laurent. So it's actually hard to come up with a signal of Canadianness without thinking of Louis Saint Laurent. Peacekeeping, hospital insurance. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Patrice. Stephen, as I'm going to turn to you now. Stephen, you've rated prime ministers. You've written about them extensively. In the essays in this book, you talk with great precision about Saint Laurent's management style, which was a kind of a combination of a corporate lawyer, chief executive, but he always knew his briefs better than his own ministers. Tell us a little bit about what made Saint Laurent such a capable leader and such an extraordinary manager of his many files.
Sure. Two things stand out for me.
How can I get the lens?
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Two things stand out. One is, when I began the research, I had this belief that Saint Laurent was the chairman of the board. And this is a phrase that's used. I don't think there's any phrase that's used to describe Saint Laurent more often than this phrase, that he was chairman of the board. And it gives you the impression of an elder statesman who chaired cabinet meetings and was almost a figurehead in the government, and that the real executive power in the government was exercised by strong ministers like C.D. Howe. And this is repeated over and over again by journalists, political scientists, historians. And what struck me doing this research is that it's just wrong. There's no other way to put it. It does not accurately reflect Saint Laurent's position in the government. I call my chapter the predominant prime minister, because it very much, he was the predominant figure in the cabinet and in Ottawa. Now, I'm not saying that he micromanaged.
No, that's
Saint Laurent let ministers run their own departments.
business.
Ministers proposed policies to cabinet, but he handled key files himself. He was very active in international affairs. He was very active in federal provincial relations. And when he saw a problem, he had no hesitation in stepping forward, even if it was in somebody else's bailiwick. He had no problem stepping forward and saying, this is what I think should be done. So somebody mentioned the RRSP. You'll probably be less keen on this legacy of Louis Saint Laurent, but he was responsible for the T1 income tax form. The old form was very difficult to manage. And so he set out in a 6-page memo the problems with the old income tax form. And this led to the creation of the T1 form, which back then was much easier to handle than it is now. Saint Laurent had views on issues. He wasn't just sitting back, a neutral observer. On some issues, he had very strong views. Ministers had to win him over. It wasn't enough to go in the cabinet room and convince the other ministers. You had to convince the prime minister himself. Paul Hellyer, who was in the cabinet, later said that decisions in the Canadian cabinet room are made by consensus. And consensus is defined as being one or more ministers of whom the prime minister is one. In other words, there is no consensus without the prime minister. So Louis Saint Laurent very much determined his government's tone and direction. The second thing that stood out for me is that Saint Laurent led by persuasion and not coercion. So in the Canadian system, in the traditional Westminster system, the prime minister has enormous power. The prime minister makes and breaks ministers. The prime minister gives ministers their mandate. What's striking to me is I couldn't find any occasion where Saint Laurent fired a minister or even threatened to fire a minister. I couldn't find any occasion where Saint Laurent went to a potentially disloyal caucus member and said, hey, if you behave, you'll come into cabinet. If you don't, you'll be kicked out of caucus. There was none of that. He didn't use the power of his office to win loyalty. He won their loyalty through their respect. Saint Laurent engendered reverence among his followers. And I think there are 3 elements to this reverence. One is intellect. Jacques Pickersgill, one of Saint Laurent's cabinet ministers, said that Saint Laurent had intellectual primacy over the cabinet. He had extensive knowledge of the political issues of the day. He would walk into the cabinet room often knowing more about a particular issue than the responsible minister. In fact, some ministers were intimidated and didn't want to speak in cabinet for fear of looking a fool, because Saint Laurent knew the issues so well. The reverence also came from his personal integrity. Again, to quote Jacques Pickersgill, Pickersgill said that Saint Laurent had moral ascendancy over the cabinet. He was a thoroughly honest man, a thoroughly modest man. Robert Bothwell, I seem to recall, once said that Louis Saint Laurent was the only Canadian prime minister who wasn't an egomaniac. And he was totally devoid of any sort of vindictiveness or spite or malice. He just wasn't capable of it. And this you can put in sharp contrast with the man who succeeded him, John Diefenbaker, who spent a lot of his time in office carrying out vendettas. And the third thing that engendered reverence among his followers was his capacity as a decision maker. He could cut to the core of any issue. He ran his cabinet very efficiently in an orderly way, unlike his predecessor, Mackenzie King, and his successor, John Diefenbaker, who had chaotic cabinet meetings that ran forever. And after he felt an issue had been discussed adequately, Saint Laurent would sum up. He would sum up in a way that it was impossible to disagree with him. He would present his views in such a clear way that nobody could find fault with him, and that became the decision. So he really won over just an incredible amount of loyalty. I don't think there's any prime minister in Canadian history who won the loyalty of his followers more effectively than Louis Saint Laurent. And I mentioned one last thing about his effectiveness within the party, and that was he was popular across the country, so much so that the Liberals were convinced they couldn't win without him. And not only that they couldn't win without him, but that as long as Louis Saint Laurent was leader, they could never lose. And this, I think, furthered that loyalty that they had towards him.
Philip, let me turn to you. Stephen, I think, has raised some of the fascinating aspects of Saint Laurent's career, his legal acumen, his legal experience. He was a KC, I think, at a very young age. He got an LLD from Laval. At an equally young age, he was clearly a legal rising star. Tell us about how his legal mind made him such an extraordinarily successful politician, or where did it hamper his success as a politician?
Well, it's certainly true that he was an exceptional law student and lawyer. He was gold medalist in law at Laval, and he would have been the first Rhodes Scholar from Laval, except he turned it down to go into practice. It's also worth remembering that he was the first Francophone president of the Canadian Bar Association from 1930 to 1932. It was very unusual for Francophone lawyers from Quebec to be known outside Quebec. Certainly many Anglophone lawyers from Quebec were, but not Francophone lawyers. And he really kind of forged that path in many ways. And I'll just say people have talked about how he often knew the briefs better than the ministers. That's his legal mind. That's how did he get to be such a successful lawyer? The reason you're a successful lawyer is prepare, prepare, prepare. You know the case inside out much better than your adversary. You know it better than the judge. You know everything about it. And clearly he carried over that kind of concern for preparation into his political life. But being a lawyer's lawyer is not always the best thing. When you become Minister of Justice or Prime Minister, sometimes lawyers can get too focused on minutiae, precedent, details. And when you have those high positions, you need a certain breadth of vision and a willingness sometimes to flout convention when necessary. Now, as Patrice has said, I think that Saint Laurent did possess this in a whole variety of policy fields. On the strictly law and justice side of things, I think he was more of a traditionalist, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and although there were some exceptions that I'll talk about. Where he did really shine, in my estimation, on the law and justice side was his attempts to improve the quality of the judiciary. And Patrice has already mentioned how he was in charge when appeals to the Privy Council were abolished finally. He was the one who had to shepherd that legislation through Parliament. It was something that had been, he didn't invent this idea, it had been hanging fire for quite some time, but he was the one who actually accomplished it. Along with making the Supreme Court truly supreme, it expanded by 2 members from 7 to 9 to get to the size we are today. And the 2 members that he chose after consultation were really, I think, about the best that could have been made at the time. John Cartwright from Ontario and Gerald Fauteux from Quebec. Each of them, in their turn, became Chief Justice later on in the 60s and 70s. Both were very well known. They were lawyers at the top of their game. Fauteux was a judge at this point. He'd just been a judge for a couple of years. So he got off to a very good start, I would say, on that side. With regard to the federally appointed judiciary, the changes he brought about were glamorous, but they were important. First of all, he increased their salaries. You're not going to believe this, but federally appointed judges had not had a raise between 1920 and 1946. Same salary in 1920 as they had in 1946. Saint Laurent first gave them a raise when he was Minister of Justice in 46, was he still Minister of Justice? Anyway, he gave them raises in 46 and in 49. And this is where being a lawyer, I think, really differentiated him from Mackenzie King. Mackenzie King was just not interested in these kinds of issues at all and kind of went along with the populist idea that judges were kind of parasitic in some ways and why should they get high salaries and not have to do very much. Saint Laurent wanted to improve the quality of the judiciary, and he knew there was simply no chance at the salaries that were currently on offer. He wanted to attract better candidates, and even with these raises, these were by no means princely salaries, but they certainly offered more of a possibility of attracting good candidates than before. Now, with regard to his actual appointments, he did begin to branch out in some new directions. I mean, the 1950s are not hugely known for their commitment to diversity, so we shouldn't have our sights too high there. But he did appoint the first 2 Jewish Superior Court judges in Canada. Harry Batshaw was appointed to the Quebec Superior Court in 1950, and Sam Friedman to the Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench in 1952. There was not a lot of credit or payback for doing this in the early 1950s, and in Quebec, the Francophone press was not at all happy about Batshaw's appointment. But in Manitoba too, Friedman's appointment was very controversial. There really wasn't a lot of a lot of credit. So here's where Saint Laurent and his Minister of Justice, Stuart Garson, who supported this initiative, they certainly had to show leadership in that field. They also showed leadership in diversity of another kind, which is diversity among lawyers themselves. Some of the judges that were appointed under Saint Laurent represented emerging areas of law, such as administrative law or labor law, or they had experience in administrative tribunals, because of course these had begun to proliferate during the war. Now, this was not appreciated by older members of the bar, who thought that only the traditional litigator types, only the barrister types should be elevated to the bench, and that lawyers who served on these new wartime tribunals were not really lawyers at all. They were just civil servants, and God forbid they were paid a salary instead of earning their keep with fees paid by clients. You know, they weren't really independent lawyers. So there was this kind of cultural divide among older lawyers and newer lawyers, and to a pretty significant extent, Saint Laurent and Garson sided with the newer lawyers. They also appointed the first academic to the bench, Vincent MacDonald, who was Dean of Law at Dalhousie. He was appointed in 1950, and that was very much not in the English tradition at all. It was certainly more in the American tradition of having academics appointed to higher courts. But this had never been done in Canada before, and of course this was the first of really, I mean, it took a while for this tradition to get going. Boralaskin was the next academic appointee, but today we have 3 former career academics on the Supreme Court of Canada. So he kind of started that ball rolling. The one appointment I will mention that wasn't as popular, he tried to sort of pass it off as a diversity appointment, but it didn't really fly, and that was Douglas Abbott from his own cabinet, who he appointed to the Supreme Court in 1954. And I think Saint Laurent was genuinely concerned to show that an Anglo-Protestant from Quebec should have a chance at the Supreme Court of Canada, that such a person should not be disentitled because of their ethnic and religious background. But the fact of appointing this type of person from his cabinet wasn't great. Laurier had done that twice, but it hadn't been done since, and it hasn't been done since then. So the Abbott appointment was kind of an outlier and was kind of somewhat puzzling to people at the time. I'll just say a last word about capital punishment, which I also touch on in my chapter. It's obvious in some ways, of course, the most important justice issue that there could possibly be. And strangely enough, when you look through the memoirs and biographies of Canadian prime ministers prior to Pearson, when of course it became irrelevant because we suspended capital punishment, it doesn't get much airtime in biographies of Canadian prime ministers, even though, of course, every capital sentence had to be reviewed by the cabinet and might be commuted. And of course, many sentences were commuted. Here, Saint Laurent was more of a traditionalist. There were 80 people hanged during his tenure as prime minister, about 9 or 10 a year, almost 1 a month. The commutation rate over his whole time was 36%. Just over a third were commuted, so 2/3 the law was left to its operation, as the expression went. He was a little harsher than Mackenzie King, but way harsher than Diefenbaker, whose commutation rate was 79%. So many fewer people went to the gallows proportionately under Diefenbaker than under Saint Laurent. On the other hand, it's hard to say that Saint Laurent was out of line with public sentiment in the 1950s. There was not a huge push for abolition of the capital penalty, and really it was pretty much part of the culture of the day, and Saint Laurent did not really try to challenge that in any way. So that's perhaps a more serious note to end on. But maybe let me just put something in here as I'm concluding. Jean said that modesty wasn't really the right word, and I think the right word for him is actually humility. And I think and this goes along with what Bothwell said, he was the only person who wasn't an egomaniac. And when I hear and I think about humility, I think about Catholic values and Catholic upbringing. And I mean, the difference, I think we can say Protestants and Catholics value modesty. I'm not sure Protestants traditionally valued humility. That is a very kind of Catholic value. And if we have time later, I wouldn't mind hearing more from Jean about Saint Laurent, the influence of Catholic values and Catholic upbringing on her grandfather, because I think that's an important aspect of him that unites many of the things that we're talking about that perhaps doesn't get a lot of airtime.
Thank you, Philip. An intriguing question. An intriguing question to end on. Thank you. When you look back historically at the Canadian justice ministers and Canadian prime ministers from Quebec who've gone through that Catholic social justice tradition, there are quite a number. So we can come back to that in a moment. But let's talk politics a little bit with Bernie Saint Laurent, who was literally at the front door of Quebec politics for a generation. He's the voice that we remember for every election coverage. You had a double mandate of covering Quebec nationalism. You were a great nephew of Saint Laurent. Tell us a little bit about both aspects. The book is a bit harsh, frankly, on Saint Laurent, a number of issues, native residential schools being one, but his notion of bilingualism in the Canadian state would be another, where he doesn't get very high grades. So tell us, Bernie, a little bit about Saint Laurent, his understanding of Quebec nationalism, his dealings with his arch rival Duplessis, and the way in which you yourself lived through Quebec politics as a descendant of one of its favorite sons.
Right. Well, thank you for inviting me. I would say that for me, I kind of divide it into three sections. The first one was when I was young in the village where he was adored. There are several pictures of him with hundreds of people gathered around, and everybody loved him. And of course, I thought he was fantastic because he was my grandfather's brother, and my grandfather could do no wrong in my eyes. So the popularity and the, I'm trying to think of the appropriate word, the respect, you could feel it. It was there among young people and older people as well. The second phase, I think, was when I started working at the National Assembly in November of 1976, a couple of weeks before the election of the Parti Québécois. And in those days, the name Louis Saint Laurent was a bad name. People saw him as someone who constantly worked to reduce provincial autonomy. And when I was studying in law school, there were people who suggested that he was a traitor. So in the context of late 70s and 1980s, there were quite a lot of people who either dismissed him or who openly resented him. And the third part, because I think is also very important to mention, was that outside the political arena, pretty well throughout my lifetime, actually, I don't think I've ever encountered someone who was alive during that period who didn't have good things to say, or saw them in a very favorable way. And that made me understand that there are waves in politics, and particularly in Quebec and Quebec nationalism. One thing that comes to mind is Duplessis was able to stand up and eventually win one of the long-standing disputes, but in the after 1995, after the referendum, Lucien Bouchard also denounced and decried intervention of the federal government as being outrageous and unacceptable. And quite frankly, even though he was the most popular politician in the province, it just didn't lift. People really didn't care. And I think that's one of the reasons why Bouchard ultimately thought that maybe being premier of the province wasn't necessarily all that he wanted to do with his life.
And what about you personally, Bernie? So you're covering Saint Laurent, and you are a Saint Laurent. How does that play?
It plays very well, and I have to say it plays much better after having read this book, because there's you were talking about the photos. I think that the photos themselves revealed a person to me that I didn't know, because when he came to visit, especially after he'd retired from politics, he was much older, but he was still agreeable. He would always make a point of coming to our house to spend a little time with my mother. And one time he was there because they were naming the French school in Compton, École Louis Saint Laurent, and he made a little speech. And then my mother, who was accompanying him, we were all standing up for the prime minister in the classroom, and she said, "Do you see that boy in the second row there?" And he said, "Yes, I did. But you know, my mother was a school teacher, and I often paid quite a price for that. So I thought I'd give the boy a break." And that to me revealed the sense of understanding that I appreciated a lot. And in terms of getting involved in journalism, there's no point in trying to show it, but on the wall behind me, there is a photo. There's one of them with me, with Uncle Louis sitting in a Muskoka chair or an Adirondack, and another one of my looking through the lens of the kinds of cameras that journalists used in those days, the 3-angled, I think it was 8mm. And the reason why that struck me, we were Uncle Louis was visiting with Grandpapa and Aunt Laura, and the journalists were outside, and sitting around chewing the fat, whatever. And then I was focused on this camera, and the cameraman said, "Well, here, have a look at it." And I looked through the lens, and for me, it was the first time that I had seen the world in black and white, because we had no television when I was that age, and I had only seen the world the way we all, or most of us, are able to see it. And that was kind of like, it was a shock for me. And I've sometimes wondered if that didn't in some way contribute to my curiosity about journalism.
Thank you, Bernie. So we have at least one conservative among us today, Peter White, who shared a story about meeting Louis Saint Laurent. Peter, do you want to chime in with some reminiscences or stories from the other side of the political divide?
Alexander, thank you very much. I'm going to serenade you all with this song that I'm sure some of you will remember. Uncle Lou, tell us what to do. Tell us now. Uncle Lou, tell us what to do and how. From My Fair Lady, when we were all at McGill in the 1950s. Words by Tim Porteous and Jim Domville, and music by Galt McDermott from Montreal. And then I said in my little note that the second thing I remembered about Louis Saint Laurent, which is really rather sad, is that I remember reading that on the day after the 1957 election, which he lost, he was seen to be lunching all by himself in the parliamentary restaurant. And I think that's rather tragic. And then finally, in 1961, when I was at Laval and organizing the first Laval Conference on Canadian Affairs, I went to see him in his office in the Price Building. He was still practicing law. I think he was probably a senior partner of his law firm, but he received me extremely graciously. We had a very nice chat, and he couldn't have been nicer. So those are my reminiscences.
Philip, Jean, Philip Gérard asked you a question indirectly, so I'll pose it more precisely. Tell us a little bit about Saint Laurent as a Quebec leader who actually stood up to the Catholic Church in many ways. He was he had a strong and independent voice on many of the social issues which the Church took objection to, and yet, as Philip mentioned, humility seemed to be his life inspiration and his message. Tell us a little bit about your grandfather and his relationship to the Church.
Well, in the 1950s, one was enveloped that if you were Catholic and you went to a convent, you were surrounded, completely surrounded by a Catholic view of the world. The only thing that I can report is my grandparents were devout, and although my grandfather's parents had hoped that he would be a priest, he never considered it because he always said he was born to a life of learning, and being in the law was going to be a constant learning. For me, the fun of being their grandchild and being totally surrounded with everything Catholic was hearing the story that when their eldest daughter was to be feted at a dance, a ball, that in those days, the Archbishop of Quebec forbade dancing. And so they had the ball in Montreal. So they had no trouble. They had no trouble living quite a secular life. In those days as well, the Catholic Church had a list of books that were forbidden, and they were it was quite an extensive list. And this was never spoken about, but I would sit behind the chair in their house in St. Patrick's and fish out of the library books that I knew were forbidden by the church. So I would say that he was certainly capable of secular thought. And whether being Catholic is what shaped that wonderful, radiant character of his, I agree with Philip that humility is a good word. I have no idea. I think that his parents were exceptional people. Bernie's grandfather was also a very wonderful human being. And as were the two other siblings that I knew. I think they were exceptional people. They happened to be Catholic, and I don't think being Catholic totally defined him.
Alex, if I can add to that, it's important to remember that he was surrounded by Catholicism. His sister Kathleen will join an order of nuns. His brother Neil also joins the priesthood. So, I mean, they are surrounded in a very Catholic, it's a large Catholic family, and necessarily it has to affect his outlook on Canadian society, and to a certain degree on public affairs. Greg Marshallden wrote a wonderful chapter on the hesitation of the Louis Saint Laurent government in adopting hospital insurance. And I think that there was a fear, and this is not Greg's point, it's my point. Greg's chapter stands on its own. But I think that Louis Saint-Laurent saw the church as a very stabilizing influence. And he thought this like many other Quebecers, a stabilizing influence, an anchor for Quebec society, for French Canadian society, and was afraid of state involvement in healthcare. Healthcare offered by the nuns is inexpensive. And I think that Louis Saint-Laurent was quite concerned about making sure that healthcare was inexpensive and accessible. And I think that that held him back a little bit. But that's one theory. I refer you to Greg Marshallton's wonderful chapter. It's much more comprehensive than what I can offer you. But again, in the link with Catholicism, I think that kind of thing is important. It also really, and this is worth emphasizing, sharpened the end of the Louis Saint-Laurent government stick on the Cold War. He was vehemently anti-communist, and that cannot be divorced from his Catholicism. Louis Saint-Laurent fought the Cold War. He built up the military. He commissioned an aircraft carrier. He drove forward the creation of a new industry in terms of aeronautics. He wanted Canada to have planes. The Avro Arrow is started under his government. He really did not like communists and was a very happy warrior in that fight against the Russians and the Chinese. Let's not forget that he also involves Canada in the Korean War. So the Catholic dimension, it's not something we talk about an awful lot in this book, but it's certainly there.
Thank you, Patrice. It's now 7 p.m., so we got time for some questions from the floor. Patrice, how do you want to handle this? You want to unmute everyone and ask for questions, or how did you anticipate?
Sure, let me see if I can do that. I know I can mute everybody, but to ask me to unmute everybody. Here we go. I've asked everybody to unmute. So if you want to ask a question verbally, just click on your bottom left-hand screen where it says mute. You click on it and it goes unmute. Or if you want to ask a question on the chat line, I'm looking at it. Alex is looking at it.
It's unmuted.
There you go.
We don't.
Will the book be published in French?
Is John done?
Okay, this is a good question. This is a good question. Will the book be published in French? I'm going to yield to Jean because that's now her mission. But this is a big book and it should be translated into French. But Jean, go ahead. Tell your tale.
It's been, I can tell you, John, that Les Presses de l'Université de Laval have indicated considerable interest in publishing it, in translating it. And then can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. But there are costs for the translation and there are costs for the publication. And I expected that it wouldn't be difficult to raise money to do that, but there's a particular set of circumstances and it hasn't been possible to give a tax receipt for it. So it's on standby while I work out my relationship for another aspect of Louis Saint-Laurent's legacy, which is at Laval University.
The other answer to this is that the older among us would refer to the Canada Council for that kind of thing. That would be the natural thing to do. Let's have some money to translate this wonderful book on a Canadian Prime Minister that has shaped the country. The Canada Council does not fund translations anymore. There it is.
Hi, I want to ask a question. It's Marcia McClung. Where did Louis Saint-Laurent stand on culture? And I know about the Canada Council, but he lived during a period of great flowering of Quebec artistry, theater, visual arts. Was he a supporter of the arts personally?
Well, shall I answer, Alex?
Sure, you can start.
Yeah, good. I think that he was a very busy man who was enthusiastic because I have postcards from him mentioning concerts or plays that he'd been to. But you have to remember that in the 50s, the offerings were much smaller than they are now, even in Quebec. But he seemed to have some awareness and some enthusiasm. I think I would say he had zero talent And I think in his hesitation in starting the Canada Council, endowing the Canada Council, it had to do with jurisdictional issues, because it really was a provincial jurisdictional issue, culture has been. And he was, I think, very hesitant to, given other things that he was trying to negotiate with the province.
But the point is well taken that there is fantastic flowering of Canadian culture in the late 40s and 1950s. And I think he's very sensitive to it. There's a lot of strikes in the early 1950s. You sense a Canada that is transforming, a very modern Canada, a Canada where there is contestation of the status quo on the cultural side and the social side, and responding to that. He's responding to that. The other issue I wanted to bring out was immigration, and the Saint Laurent government will welcome more immigrants than any others until that time, since the Laurier boom years. A dramatic increase in the number of immigrants, and increasingly opening up immigration to the Caribbean, to Asia. This is where, again, the policy of the government of Canada starts to change. It will change for good in the 1960s, but there's a definite root in that new openness in the 1950s. So culture in the sense of arts and literature, but also culture in the sense of a Canadian culture that is called to transform and to modernize.
Can anybody compare Laurier to Saint Laurent?
Stephen, do you want
Has
to
anybody done it?
Impact.
Stephen Azzi, do you want to tackle that question? Compare Laurier to Saint Laurent?
It's a hard comparison to make. I know that one of the reasons Saint Laurent was willing to be prime minister was to make the point that French Canadians could be prime minister, and that Laurier wasn't an exception. I think they were similar in that they straddled the two divides, but the times that they lived in were quite different. And I think Laurier was much more the extrovert, much more of a flamboyant character. Saint Laurent more modest and more reserved. So in personality, they were different. I think Saint Laurent was a much better manager of cabinet and government. Laurier, I mean, we shouldn't ever say anything wrong about anything negative about Laurier, but the reality is that he wasn't much of a manager. I think Patrice could probably speak to this better than I could.
Well, you know, the one thing I would add is that Louis Saint Laurent knew Wilfrid Laurier and admired Wilfrid Laurier a great deal. I think in terms of management, there's no doubt that Louis Saint Laurent brought enormous baggage, I mean, enormous managerial ability that Wilfrid Laurier simply did not have. And I think that in that regard, it was very different. There are also more people who are willing to challenge Laurier, even though they respected him and loved him dearly. But there are people from the West, people from Quebec, Henri Bourassa, that challenged Laurier, even though they loved him. The issues that swelled around imperialism, around the sense of Canada as a country of the British Empire, was overwhelming, and they opposed him, and that challenged Laurier in a way that Louis Saint Laurent was never challenged, even by Duplessis. It was just simply not the same kind of movement. So the comparisons are tough to make in regards to that.
Thank you.
I'd like to hear one of you speak a little bit about the challenge that Jean issued to us today, which is the politics of reputation. How do you explain Laurier's standing, and how do current prime ministers manage or curate their own reputations? I think it's something that some prime ministers have managed extraordinarily diligently. Just think of how Trudeau created his own visual memoirs, but other prime ministers have also spent significant amounts of time managing their reputation both during and after their career in politics. Patrice, how do you explain Laurier's reputation that Bernie so evocatively mentioned, that he was not just an anathema in Quebec, but almost unknown to the generation of politicians just a generation afterwards?
Louis Saint Laurent, I mean, this is something that I lament. How come nobody ever calls themselves a Louis Saint Laurent kind of liberal, or even a Louis Saint Laurent kind of conservative? You can actually get away with that. I think that there was, again, it comes back to the humility of Louis Saint Laurent, and also the example that he inspired in his family. That we don't brag about these things, Louis the father, Louis the grandfather was a great man, an honorable man, and the family knew it, and that's good enough. I think that that's truly unfortunate, and I'm hoping that this book will launch. It's not the final word. It's 500 pages of words, but it's not the final word. And there is a great deal that needs to be done to revive that reputation. I'm hoping that we've laid some seeds into the ground here, and that other people will bring it up. But there needs to be a move. I mean, if we're going to talk about reputations, I mean, Stephen Azzi can talk about where he ranks. He always ranks very highly among prime ministers. It's just that people don't know why. Stephen.
Yes, I would say that one of the things I've noticed when we survey academics about the prime ministers is the prime ministers who place the highest are the prime ministers we know the most about. So we know a lot about Macdonald, Mackenzie, King, and Laurier, and so they rank high. I think one of the reasons Saint Laurent is down around 5th or 6th in most surveys is that we know so little about him. Saint Laurent is partly to blame for that himself, because he felt that he hadn't accomplished anything in government. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't cooperate, as Laurier did with O.D. Skelton, in creating a biography. His papers are a mess. All of us who worked on this book will tell you how difficult it was to find out anything about Louis Saint Laurent, because his papers at Library and Archives Canada are in such disarray. It's clear that a lot of records weren't kept. They were disposed of at some point. And just trying to reconstruct what happened in the man's life is a real challenge. For a historian, Louis Saint Laurent is our nemesis.
So Patrice, you're expecting him to rise from 6 to 2 with the publication of this book. Am I saying that properly?
He's gonna have a tough race, but Stephen Azzi's point is a very important one. There's a rumor that Saint Laurent's biographer, there was a biographer in 1967, Dale Thompson, and the evil rumor is that Dale Thompson pruned out the archives. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but he would have taken out stuff that maybe did not fit with a certain idea. This is something that happens a lot, but it's I mean, I went through, I won't say I went through all the papers, but I went through a lot of papers, and every now and then you'd get a letter from Louis Saint Laurent's hand, and it was a rare thing. I quote one letter when he talks about women in politics. He says, of course, women should be in politics, but be careful. Once they start running, they're going to be elected, and then you guys are going to have to deal with it. So it's a compelling, and this comes from him. It's a letter that he wrote, and and it's a good letter. It gives you a sign, I think, a sign of his sense of humor.
Then I'm going to get my pajamas.
Thank you, Patrice. Jean, can we give you the last word? Can we have you say, we've heard the plea for help for the French translation. It's in the hands of superior beings, but how can we make this book sing? It's a wonderful publication. I'll show you the cover again. It is available from UBC Press, from Amazon, from Chapters Online. So get a copy. It's a great read. It's episodic because it's 22 chapters, so you don't feel like the tome is too big to carry with you. It reads very easily with 4 chapters by Patrice and a really wonderful introductory essay from Jean. So, Jean, the last word.
Well, all I can say is thank you, and And here's to a sense of history opening up. We live in a country where the past scarcely exists. And so it would be nice to think that history matters to more people, and it's all of us who care need to be persuasive about it.
Yeah.
Patrice, you want to,
So,
any last
thank-
words from you, Patrice?
There's a question by Jamie Laidlaw who is asking, I don't know if he's still there, who is asking about how Louis Saint Laurent dealt with prairie populism. I have a great chapter on the voting coalition that supported Louis Saint Laurent. I have to say, Louis Saint Laurent never lost an election, okay? Even in 1957, he won the popular vote. He lost the number of seats, and he lost a lot of cabinet ministers, but he won the popular vote. It's important to remember. How he dealt with prairie populism? Well, on the left, he basically got rid of it, but on the right, it was certainly evident that in Alberta, social credit played an important role as the 1950s emerged. The 1950s is really about how the left erodes and how the right starts to emerge. Final word, Louis Saint Laurent was, for me, and I think for most of the contributors, we have a lot of critical contributors here. It's not an encensement, as we say in French. It's not a glorification of Louis Saint Laurent. We brought together people, serious people, who are doing a serious assessment of Louis Saint Laurent, good and bad. But it's a man worth discovering. It's a man, especially in this age of Trumpism and
Somebody that knows nothing about.
glorification. It's he's an important reminder that there's a different way of doing politics, and I think should be an example for everybody.
So send them a book.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. We've had a wonderful evening of discussion and conversation, presentations. I want to thank Patrice for being the author of this compendium, Jean for initiating it, all the other contributors, Philip and Stephen for their presence today, and Bernie Saint Laurent for his unique perception of his great uncle. Thank you so much for being here. Good luck, Jean, with the book. This is launched in pomp and enthusiasm. We're hoping great success, and we're looking forward to the French language launch in due course. So thank you everyone for being here this evening.
Thank you
Good
for
night.
including me.
Bonne soirée.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night. Thank you for the invitation.
That was great.
What?
Hey, Bethel.